Deuces.
So you ready to get started, Nick?
I'm ready.
All right, so thank you all for coming. Today we have Nick Diana to give his defense of his thesis. Ken Katinger and myself are co-chairs. On his committee is Sharon Carver, Jessica Hammer, and Matt Easterday is the external rep from Northwestern. Nick today is going to talk about his value adaptive instruction and talking about civil discourse and addressing bias, which has become more relevant in the past few weeks, I think. So looking forward to it, Nick. Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you all for joining me for my defense. My name is Diana. Today I'm going to be presenting my work on value adaptive instruction and the educational game that we developed that uses value adaptive instruction to teach civil discourse skills and address bias. So my work is in the area of civic technology, which is concerned with how we can use technology to be better or more engaged citizens. And specifically, I'm interested in how people talk about and reason about politics, and how we can use technology to make that civil discourse more productive. And when I say productive, here's what I mean. So we intentionally use the term productivity here rather than civility, mostly because civility outside of the academic literature has kind of become a loaded term that sometimes means engaging in behavior that is decidedly unproductive. So instead, we subscribe to Papacharyssi's definition, which is the notion that the purpose of civility is not to ensure that the conversation is polite or flows smoothly, but rather it's to ensure that the conversation fosters democratic goals. So that's what we mean by productivity. It fosters democratic goals. And this distinction is important because discourse governed solely by politeness can silence marginalized voices in an effort to minimize conversational friction. Civil discourse is how we as citizens build the support that we need to reach shared goals. It's a foundational activity for any functioning democracy. But how and where we're talking about politics is also changing. More and more of these important but often difficult conversations are happening in online spaces. And unfortunately, most Americans find it stressful and frustrating to talk about politics online. If you ask people to compare political discussions online in social media with other places where they discuss politics, people say that discussions on social media are less respectful, less civil, less focused on policy, less informative, angrier, and less likely to come to a resolution, so unproductive. Americans are also becoming more polarized than they've been in the past. So these two graphs show how the ideological centers of Democrats and Republicans have drifted further apart over the years. And so if you're like me and might place yourself closer to the ends of these graphs, you might say, what's so bad about my party becoming more aligned with my views? And nothing's wrong with that. The problem is a failure to convince people from the other side of the aisle to make that shift along with you. So instead of skewing this distribution, we've made it more bimodal. It turns out that this ideological distance manifests physically in what some people call information bubbles. So for example, here's a map showing the lack of connectivity between Twitter users that supported Hillary Clinton and Twitter users that supported Donald Trump. The Trump supporters in particular are very connected to each other and isolated from others. And there's probably lots of reasons why this happens, but it's likely that one of them is a phenomenon called my-side bias. And my-side bias occurs when people evaluate evidence and test hypotheses in a manner that's biased toward their own prior opinions and attitudes. So for example, you might know people who, when they disagree with something, they're immediately skeptical of that thing. But if they agree with it, they blindly accept it as true. In both cases, the amount of critical thought that they're exercising, how they're consuming that content, is dependent on this dynamic relationship between the user and the content they're consuming. So one of the reasons why these information bubbles are so dangerous is because if you're surrounded by information that aligns with your beliefs and your fundamental conception of reality, then there's no incentive to be skeptical about it. And because these bubbles are isolated, there's no one with conflicting beliefs who has an incentive to be skeptical, who has an incentive to pop the bubble. I personally believe that identifying and popping these information bubbles is an incredibly important civic duty that we have in this modern age of civil discourse. However, going around popping bubbles willy-nilly can also be dangerous because in some cases it may make the problem worse. For example, Facebook got a lot of flack in 2016 for not doing enough to counter the misinformation and disinformation circulating freely on their platform. So around 2017, they implemented this feature, which gave users a little red warning message if the news headline was disputed by third-party fact checkers. They ended up removing this flagging system because when they tested it, they found that in some cases, it made the problem worse. According to one of the lead developers, putting a strong image like a red flag next to an article may actually entrench deeply held beliefs, the opposite effect of what we intended. So in the literature, this is called the backfire effect. So the question is, how do we engage with the other side on important issues in a way that engenders progress rather than entrenching them further in their beliefs and widening this gap? And while we're on the subject, if this is such a vital civic skill, why don't we all already know how to do it? But before we get into that, here's an overview of the rest of the talk today. We've already talked a little bit about the state of civil discourse in America. Next, we're going to discuss some of the structural challenges in civic education and why it's hard to teach civil discourse skills in the classroom. Then I'm going to walk through the design of the educational game we developed and how different design elements address these civic education challenges. And then I'm going to describe the experiment we designed to test the effectiveness of our game and the results of that experiment. And finally, I'll end the talk with a broader discussion about the implications of this work with respect to civic technology, learning science in general, and human-computer interaction research. But first, let's talk about what makes teaching civil discourse skills uniquely challenging. So as part of this work, we conducted a series of interviews with civics educators, and those interviews revealed 3 unique structural challenges in this space. First, students simply lack opportunities to practice practical civic skills in a scaffolded way. So for example, one proven method for making civil discourse more productive is to practice a skill called perspective taking, which is basically how well you can put yourself in someone else's shoes and empathize with their position. Perspective taking is a civic skill, just how finding the area of a triangle is a geometry skill. And similarly, these kinds of skills need to be practiced. It's not enough to understand this as a concept or as a principle. Students need to know when and how to apply that principle, and that takes practice. Perspective taking is just one of a huge number of skills that form the foundation of productive civil discourse. But the problem is getting enough practice on these skills to really master them is impossible in a classroom of 20 to 30 students. And this has nothing to do with the quality of the instructor and everything to do with how these skills have to be practiced. So consider the following civics classroom where students are having a class discussion. Ideally, you have one student talking at a time, but that also means that only one student gets to practice these skills at a time, while all the other students kind of wait their turn. And this isn't even considering the time it takes for the expert facilitator to give them feedback on their performance on these skills. Now contrast that with a typical math classroom where you can have 30 students practicing a skill simultaneously. And because they can all practice at the same time, they can practice one skill 10, 15 times in a class period. So this is the first challenge. There's just not enough time for students to get enough scaffolded practice on key civic skills. The second major challenge in this space is the unscalability of individualized debiasing instruction. So what do I mean by that? Remember earlier when we discussed the role that bias plays in creating and perpetuating information bubbles. It turns out that civics educators are well aware of the impact of bias on reasoning in this space. And to help combat some of these biases in the classroom, several of the teachers I interviewed mentioned that if they happen to have a student who is pro-gun rights, for example, they'll assign that student to defend a pro-gun control position, effectively forcing the student to engage in perspective taking. This is kind of the traditional classroom version of what we're calling value adaptive instruction, which is instruction that recognizes that there is a dynamic relationship between our values and the values latent in what we're reading or listening to. And that by adapting instruction based on that relationship, we can improve the efficiency of the acquisition of certain skills. So unfortunately, with one teacher, this kind of adaptation isn't scalable. It's unreasonable to ask one teacher to know the positions of their 30 students on every topic that they cover, and then to adapt instruction accordingly to each student. So that's the second challenge in this space. Individualized debiasing instruction is unscalable. Finally, the third challenge in this space is the fact that the context in which students practice these skills has unique social dimensions that generally don't appear in other domains. First, in some cases, students' identity is linked to the instructional content. And if their belief on this topic is foundational to who they are as a person, that's going to change how open they are to considering alternative viewpoints, for example. According to the teachers we interviewed, students also experience a very real pressure to conform to the beliefs of their peers or their parents. And this means that even the act of participation comes with some potential social risk. So to address these challenges, we turn to educational games, primarily because games have a number of useful features that complement these challenges nicely. Games can provide a non-threatening environment that puts emotional space between the player and the character. They also allow us to give gradual, scaffolded exposure to these challenging concepts rather than kind of throwing students into the deep end of a classroom discussion and asking them to practice all these skills in parallel. Games tend to be more engaging than traditional instruction, not always more effective, but generally more engaging. Single-player games specifically allow students to explore these values outside of the influence of those social pressures we talked about earlier, which allows students to take risks without the social consequences that they might see in a classroom discussion. Okay, so we've talked about the unique challenges in this space, and now we're going to discuss how the educational game we designed addresses these challenges. Our design process was guided by the transformational framework, and we went through several iterations of paper prototyping and playtesting before ultimately developing a digital game. We also ran a small-scale pilot study prior to our full-scale experiment. So just to give an idea of the prototyping process, here's a photo of one of the few elements that persisted and evolved through the many paper iterations and ended up in the digital iteration as well. A great deal of the design process was focused on what Lynch calls the recharacterization of aspects of this complex, ill-defined domain into something that's definable, and then the simplification of those relationships as much as possible. So here's a photo of an early iteration showing the kind of complex mess of connections between game elements. On later versions, this is greatly reduced and streamlined. So another major challenge during the design process was having a research assistant that would literally walk all over your paper prototypes. So the end product of this process was our game, Persuasion Invasion. The premise of the game is that aliens are invading the planet, but these aliens are pacifists. So they don't conquer planets through warfare. Instead, they sow discord in communities and make the people in those communities unable to work together to solve even basic problems. And each level focuses around a different scenario. And scenarios were designed to be evocative, but also relevant to students. And we intentionally avoided well-worn issues like gun control or climate change because students probably already have an established belief, or if they don't, they probably know what their political tribe wants them to believe about those issues. And one of the reasons we made the game single player, again, is to, we wanted players to have an opportunity to learn the kind of things that they value outside of the influence of their political tribes. To win each level, players must persuade each townsperson to move into the town square, which symbolizes their willingness to work together to solve the problem at hand. Spatially, this also acts as a visual metaphor for people coming together. To persuade townspeople, players first have to play detective, gathering clues about each townsperson so that they can identify what they value. Each townsperson cares about one of 5 different values, and these are based off of Haidt's moral foundations theory. which argues that there are at least five what he calls moral foundations that serve as the basis for how we make moral judgments. So care, which has to do with whether or not someone's harmed; fairness, which has to do with fairness; loyalty, which has to do with the interests of the group, like patriotism; authority, which has to do with respecting laws and traditions; and sanctity, which has to do with sacredness. And studies have shown that different groups of people weight these foundations differently. So liberals tend to prioritize the care and fairness foundations, while kind of not emphasizing the other three, whereas conservatives tend to have a more equal distribution across all five foundations and putting a little less weight on care and fairness. So the first step is identifying which one of these five foundations each townsperson values. And after a player has identified what a townsperson values, they still might have to reduce that townsperson's tribalism score. So tribalism in the game is essentially a measure of how open a townsperson is to being persuaded. If a townsperson's tribalism is high, there's a good chance your persuade action will fail. And players can reduce tribalism by playing these green cards like conversation reset, point of agreement, or confirm understanding. Once you've identified a townsperson's values and reduced their tribalism, then you can attempt to persuade them. This action allows you to choose the statement that will be most persuasive to this specific townsperson. These statements are some of the beliefs from the other opposing side of the issue. And each of these statements appeals to one of those five foundations. Our job is to, in this case, choose a statement that matches what Claire values. If we choose the right option, then she moves into the town square. So playing cards and persuading characters costs energy, which is meant to emphasize the fact that engaging in productive discourse in real life can be exhausting. When players run out of energy, they can choose to end the day to replenish their energy. But when night falls, the aliens come out and they get their chance to sow more discord into the community. So returning to the challenges that we identified earlier, we can see that by using what is essentially a civil discourse simulator, we can provide students with many more opportunities to practice key skills and provide these opportunities in a scaffolded way alongside feedback. A single player game also allows us to mitigate some of the social pressures that students might normally feel during classroom discussions. The last challenge we need to address is how to provide individualized debiasing instruction in a scalable way. So remember that good debiasing interventions need to be value adaptive. They recognize how we reason about content depends on our relationship to that content, and then adapt instruction based on that relationship. We call this relationship alignment. And it's the alignment between user values and the values latent in content. When alignment is high, we expect people to be more biased. And when it's low, we expect people to be more skeptical or less biased. Computing alignment requires three ingredients. First, a way to estimate user values. Second, a way to estimate the values latent in text. And then a way to relate these two estimates to one another. So to estimate user values, we use the Moral Foundations Theory questionnaire, which outputs a vector of 5 scores that correspond to each of Haidt's 5 moral foundations. And these scores are an estimate of how much the user values each foundation when making moral judgments. So to estimate the values latent in content, we use a natural language processing method based on distributed representations. The distributional hypothesis is the idea that you can know a word simply by the company it keeps. Essentially, we would expect that concepts that appear in similar contexts are also semantically similar to one another. So for example, if we were given these two sentences, the Zordiv sheepik was juicy and the Quindar sheepik was juicy, we couldn't say a lot about these two made-up foods, but we could be confident that they share some features like being juicy and being pickable. And by training our model on a very large corpus of text, we can use these varying contexts to begin to approximate meaning. The distributed representation of a word is simply that word's location in a low-dimensional space. And the nice thing about representing concepts this way is that means is the distance between objects in this space represents the semantic distance between them as well. So we expect closely related concepts to be spatially closer to one another. And because these locations can be represented as vectors, we can simply use cosine similarity to compute the semantic distance between two concepts. Recently, Garten and colleagues have extended this work in distributed representations to include concept dictionaries, which is great because it lets us use psychological constructs like the values in moral foundations theory. So essentially, we're computing the semantic distance between a concept dictionary and a small body of text. And to do that, we average the distributed representations of all dictionary terms, and then compute the average cosine distance between the concept representation and the representation of each word in the text. Okay, so in practice, this allows us to take as input short pieces of text, like a tweet, and output the semantic distance between that text and each of our 5 moral foundations. So the blue and red here are for positive and negative dictionary terms. So according to our model, this tweet is mostly evoking negative aspects of the authority foundation, which we defined with this dictionary of terms. Okay, so we have our estimates of user values and our estimates of content values. And to relate the two together, we simply, again, compute the cosine similarity between these two vectors. Using alignment in this way is maybe the most novel contribution of this work, because to our knowledge, this is the first time that value adaptive instruction has been implemented in a data-driven and scalable way. In the game, we use alignment to drive our value adaptive debiasing intervention. So remember that throughout the game, students are asked to choose the most persuasive argument from a list of options. We might guess that if students are biased, they may be more likely to pick the options that align with their own values rather than the values of the character they're trying to persuade. So students in the adaptive condition of the experiment see this additional warning message that serves as the intervention. It says, orange colored options may seem more persuasive to you based on your values. Remember to choose the best response for Claire in this case. And then one of the options, the option with the highest alignment score, is colored orange. Okay, so we've talked about the game we designed to address some of these structural challenges. Next, we're going to discuss the experiment we designed to test the game and the results of that experiment. Originally, we had planned to use a switching replications design that included classroom discussion data as well as data from gameplay sessions. Unfortunately, right about here in the process, PA schools were shut down. On the bright side, we were able to collect data from the first half of this experiment. So here are the participants that we were able to collect data from. There are 2 different schools, one in a rural community, one in a suburban community, across 3 different grade levels. And we collected data in both English classrooms and social studies classrooms. 3 of the students here, by the way, were excluded from analyses because they met our threshold for gaming behavior. When designing the experiment, we were interested in 3 broad questions. First, how did students feel about playing the game? Did they learn what we wanted to them to learn? And were we able to measure and mitigate the impact of bias on performance? So with respect to this first question, we assessed how students felt about the game along several dimensions using Abeel et al.'s player experience inventory. So here are all the dimensions, but just to focus on two dimensions of particular interest. So for enjoyment, for example, students were asked to rate on a 6-point Likert scale how much they agreed or disagreed with the statement, "I enjoyed playing the game." Or similarly, for learning, they were asked if they agreed that they had learned something new. So here are the results of the player experience questions. The size of the bars here indicates the number of students who responded at that level of agreement or disagreement. And I have them positioned around 0 so that to the left of 0 are negative responses and to the right of 0 are positive responses. We found that in general, students enjoyed playing the game, thought that they had learned something new, didn't think that it was too hard or too easy. In other words, felt like it was appropriately leveled. And maybe most importantly, thought that playing the game was valuable to them. And these Likert questions are useful because they provide a snapshot of how the game is performing with respect to these dimensions. Is the game meaningful, right? What they don't do is provide any information about what is meaningful or why it was meaningful. So to elicit the kind of feedback that we need to improve our performance along these dimensions in the future, we also ask players to answer two simple open-ended questions. What did you like about the game? And what did you dislike about the game? We use affinity diagramming to organize the 170 responses to these two questions. And there were many interesting themes that emerged from this process, all of which are in the document if you're interested. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to highlight just a few of the comments that provide some nuance to that quantitative Likert scale data that we talked about earlier. First, with respect to meaningfulness, several students commented on how the skills they practiced in the game could be directly applied to their real-life interactions. For example, one student in the pilot said that when he got home from school, he tried these techniques on his mom, apparently with some success. This authenticity is also likely critical to feelings of relevance, which, according to civics educators, is vital to student motivation in this domain. In addition to real-life relevance, several students also expressed appreciation for the educational value of the game, saying that they appreciated the challenge and that it wasn't, quote, mind-numbing like other games that they play. Finally, several students used this opportunity to elaborate on what they found to be enjoyable about the game. Many students pointed to the core persuasion mechanic as a source of enjoyment, which is encouraging. Other students were quick to remind us that while they enjoyed playing the game, the bar for what is enjoyable in this context is relatively low. As one student put it, better than English class, am I right? Still, there was some evidence that this enjoyment was genuine, at least in some cases. For example, one student said they had lost track of time and played it in multiple other classes, which is probably not great for that student's well-rounded education, but good feedback for us. We analyzed the log data's session timestamps and found that this student wasn't the only one to play the game outside of their normal class period. In fact, 11% of log transactions occurred outside of a student's class period, and 36% of those out-of-class transactions occurred outside of school hours entirely, with 28% of students having one out-of-class transaction and 15% of students having at least one outside of school transaction, where we might assume that the bar for what qualifies as an enjoyable experience is substantially higher. So while the majority of students agree that the game was appropriately leveled, we did find a relationship between enjoyment and grade level, with each grade enjoying the game significantly more than the grade below it. This graph shows the relationship between performance on the y-axis and enjoyment on the x-axis, and we found that higher levels of enjoyment were associated with higher levels of in-game performance, though we of course can't make any claims about the directionality of that relationship. So to recap, with respect to player experience, in general, both student ratings on the quantitative player experience inventory questions and the students' open-ended responses suggest that students found the game to be not only enjoyable and motivating, but also meaningful to their lives and valuable as an educational tool. These data also suggest that there may be a relationship between player experience and competence. The second major question we explored was, did students learn what we wanted them to learn? First, it's worth noting that most students perceive the game content as highly related to their typical classroom content, with 82% of students agreeing that the game was an effective way to practice what they had learned in class. We also asked students about the game's relation to specific curriculum skills. And both of these questions, by the way, were generated by one of the teachers from the pilot experiment. So the takeaway from this slide is that many students directly related gameplay to the kinds of skills already present in the curriculum. But these, of course, are student perceptions of learning. So let's talk about what the data says about student learning. First, we found a dosage effect on pre-post gains. We used this regression model to determine the impact of in-game performance on post-test score while controlling for pre-test score. And we found that alongside a student's pre-test score, the number of scenarios a student had completed was a significant predictor of post-test score. In addition to assessing student performance before and after the game on the pre and post test, we also assess performance during gameplay with respect to 3 civil discourse skills. First, can a student identify the value at a root of a belief? Second, do students understand how tribalism can be a barrier to discourse and what they can do to reduce tribalism? And third, given a scenario and a list of options, can students choose the most appropriate discourse move? So I'll discuss student performance on each of these in turn. The first skill was value identification. So remember, during persuade action, students have to identify which of these statements appeals to a townsperson's values. So we tested the impact of practice on performance in this skill using this mixed effects model. So here, outcome is a binary variable, 0 for incorrect, 1 for correct. Prior opportunities represents the number of times a student has attempted a value identification task prior to this attempt. And then we include a nested random effect with the student's unique identifier nested under AP, which is a binary variable indicating whether or not the class was AP, which we found to explain some variance in some models, though not in this model. Finally, we include a second random effect that represents the value students are being asked to identify. And this is a kind of knowledge component level random effect. So we found that prior opportunities was a significant predictor of outcome, suggesting that students' ability to identify values latent in text improved with practice. So students got better at identifying values with practice. The second key skill we looked at was the student's ability to effectively reduce tribalism before attempting a persuade action. So recall that each character in the game has some baseline level of political tribalism. And the higher their tribalism score, the lower the chance that the player's persuade action will be successful. Players can reduce tribalism by playing certain discourse move cards like point of agreement, conversation reset. To measure student performance on tribalism reduction over time, we calculated this ratio at each attempt. And this ratio is a comparison of the character's current tribalism level to their default level. Essentially, how much of the character's tribalism has the player reduced before attempting to persuade them. And here's what we found. So this top graph shows tribalism ratio on the y-axis and prior opportunities on the x-axis. The bottom graph simply shows the number of users in the system at each opportunity. And it's important to include this bottom graph because it lets us know that the erratic behavior in the tail end of the top graph is due to just a small number of users being left in the system. But what we also see is that while a majority of users are in the system, mean tribalism ratio decreases steadily with practice. And this suggests that students understand, at least in the context of this game, that tribalism can be a barrier to discourse and some strategies that they can use to reduce tribalism. Okay, so students get better at identifying values and they get better at reducing tribalism with practice. The last key skill we focus on is students' ability to choose the most appropriate discourse move for a given scenario. So here's a screenshot of the assessment task for this skill. It's essentially just a multiple choice question that gives the students a scenario and asks them to pick the most appropriate response. And here's what we found. So again, student performance on this task increased steadily over time. And this suggests that students' ability to identify the most appropriate discourse move for a given scenario improved with practice. So to recap with respect to learning, we found that pre-post gains were moderated by a dosage effect, with students who completed more of the game performing better on the post-test. And we also found that performance on key civic skills like value identification, tribalism reduction, and choosing appropriate discourse moves improved with practice. The last area we examined was the impact of bias, whether we can measure it and whether we can reduce it through the use of a value adaptive intervention. So here we have that screenshot of the persuade action again. So behind the scenes, the system is computing an alignment score for each of the options that the player sees. Basically, how well do a given option's latent values align with the player's values? So let's say, for example, that these are the alignment scores for these options. Now we would expect that players are going to have a harder time choosing the correct option when there are other options available that have higher alignment scores. Conversely, we would expect that players are going to have an easier time choosing the correct option when the highest aligned option also happens to be the correct one. So we can use alignment in this way to estimate difficulty with respect to bias. In this case, we define difficulty as the difference between the score of the highest aligned option and the score of the correct option. So the bigger that difference, the greater the difficulty, if students are in fact biased. If students aren't biased, or if this is a poor measure of bias, then we would expect this to have no bearing on their performance. So we used this mixed effects model to test whether or not alignment was predictive of outcomes. And we found that it was a significant negative predictor. So as expected, higher alignment was associated with worse performance. And this suggests that alignment can be used to estimate bias in this context, which is exciting. We were also interested in whether or not we could use alignment to drive a value-adaptive debiasing intervention. So we've demonstrated that we can measure bias, and now we want to know if we can reduce it. So recall that in the adaptive condition, students saw this additional message that warned them against choosing the option that aligns with their values rather than the values of the person they're trying to persuade. So to measure the impact of this intervention, we developed this composite measure that we call the bias regulation index. So essentially, this first set of parentheses gives the player credit for choosing an option that isn't the highest aligned option. And the second set of parentheses penalizes the player for choosing an option with a higher alignment score than the correct option. So negative scores in this case are associated with low bias regulation, and positive scores are associated with high bias regulation. So if students are exhibiting bias, we would expect them to do worse when they fail to overcome potential bias and better when they succeed at overcoming potential bias. So here's a graph of this relationship between our bias regulation index and student performance. And this graph shows this relationship early on in the game. We can see that as expected, high bias regulation is associated with better performance, and low bias regulation is associated with worse performance. The orange line here is the control condition, and the blue dotted line is the adaptive condition that saw the debiasing intervention. So here's that same relationship midway through the game, and here's the relationship towards the end of the game. We can see that while the relationship between regulation and performance remains relatively constant in the control condition, it seems to change in the adaptive condition. So for students with high bias regulation, seeing the debiasing intervention appears to have worked as intended. It improves their ability to regulate bias and thus their performance. Unfortunately, it appears that for students with low bias regulation, the intervention may have negatively impacted their ability to regulate bias and thus their performance. And we're not sure why this is, but some of our previous work that we've done in this area suggests that it might be due to a lack of trust in the system, or potentially an unwillingness to recognize one's own biases, a phenomenon called bias blind spot. So to recap with respect to bias, we found that alignment can be used to measure the impact of bias through our difficulty metric, and that a value adaptive debiasing intervention driven by alignment appears to have reduced bias, albeit only for students with high bias regulation. Okay, so here are the three key takeaways from this work. First, the data from our experiment showed that in general, students found the game to be both enjoyable to play and meaningful to their real-world lives. Second, log data collected during gameplay also shows that student performance on key civil discourse skills generally improve with practice. And third, our data-driven estimate of alignment, this relationship between a player's values and the values latent in the content they were reading, was predictive of performance, suggesting that our metric was able to detect and estimate potential bias. And finally, our debiasing intervention demonstrated for the first time, to our knowledge, that value adaptive systems can be used to combat biased reasoning in a nuanced and scalable way. This work does have several limitations, however. First, we sampled a population of high school age students, but because bias has known interactions with age, these results may not transfer across players of all ages. So older players may exhibit more bias, and their interaction with age and the intervention might not be the same in that case. And while Haidt argues that moral foundations theory applies universally across cultures, the content of this game was very much limited to the American political experience. Second, the process of recharacterizing an ill-defined domain often results in an oversimplification of concepts. And this could lead to some unintended consequences. So, for example, that great visual metaphor of the townspeople coming together into the town square may have been misinterpreted by some students as an endorsement of the argument to moderation fallacy. Basically, the incorrect notion that finding the middle ground is always the best option. So this is something that we explicitly try to avoid because this idea is actually quite destructive to political or productive discourse. Finally, we had hoped to be able to directly link in-game skills to changes in real-world classroom discussions, but due to our experiment being cut short, this remains an important open question for future work. So despite these limitations, we believe this work makes the following important contributions. So first, with respect to civics education, this work suggests that one way to cultivate enjoyment and motivation is to focus on practical civic skills because they're meaningful to students. Students will use them in their real lives. We also demonstrate that scalable debiasing instruction is possible, and at least in some cases, effective. With respect to learning science more generally, we demonstrate that there really are identifiable knowledge components in this ill-defined domain of civil discourse, and that scaffolded instruction and feedback can improve performance on these skills. Finally, with respect to research in human-computer interaction, this work demonstrates the use of a new dimension of adaptivity in interactive systems, value adaptivity. And more generally, this represents a shift from a narrow cognitive conception of human reasoning to a more holistic and realistic one that recognizes the role of bias. And this is particularly important for systems that assume or rely on the objectivity of human reasoning. For example, if a social media company wants to design a system that helps us consume media more responsibly, any effective system has to recognize the contexts in which we are objective reasoners and the contexts in which we are not objective reasoners, and adapt accordingly. So our future work will focus on the development of these new value adaptive systems that allow us to address our biased reasoning where and when it happens in our real lives. Okay, so I'm happy to take questions, but before I do, I hope everyone will indulge me in a moment of show and tell. So as some of you know, we're in the process of packing up the house for a big move. And while cleaning out the closets, I came across this gem. I don't know if you can see that. Which, for those of you who don't know what CMITES is, which is probably most of you, CMITES was a series of different summer camps sponsored by Carnegie Mellon University back in the day. So I did a summer camp called Fundamental Programming, which apparently you can still find the description for online. And I had to share this because I just love how one of the selling points for this summer camp is that you get to take home hard copy printouts of your code. Like, oh joy. So anyway, I got this shirt in 2001, and after 19 years, I think it is safe to say that this has been the longest, most challenging summer camp I've ever been a part of. Seriously though, I'd like to thank the university and specifically my advisors, my committee members, as well as Jeff Kaufman, Paul Sindrick, Eric Harpstead, Simon Knight, Neil Heffernan, Aaron Walker, Brianna Gallagher, the peer community, and the many, many, many other people who have helped this work at various points in the process. And I'm happy to take questions.